Hi class, welcome to our last module on citrus arthropods that you're probably going to encounter. This is module 4.5, and in this we're going to talk about mites, and then we're going to go over IPM, or integrated pest management. So the first mite that we're going to talk about is the citrus rust mite, Phyllocoptera olivera. And the rust mites, they're very, very small guys. Now, when we're talking about mites, we're talking about these arthropods that aren't insects, but some people call them insects, but they're arthropods, and they're very, very small. You're probably not going to see them with the naked eye. Some of them are large enough that you maybe can see them, but they're best observed, if you really want to see them, with a hand lens. With a hand lens, you can usually see these quite well. They're very small. The rust mite, it's deep yellow, and it's wedge-shaped, as opposed to round like a lot of mites are. And if the weather's right, there can be a new generation of rust mites within a week. If it's a little cooler or things aren't quite as conducive to development, it could take up to 32 weeks. However, since they can reproduce very rapidly, you can see that there can be very many generations of rust mites in one growing season. So 1 year can have a lot of mites. And with rust mites, the damage they cause is by feeding on the outside of the exposed surface of the fruit. Once the fruit is up to about a ½ inch or larger, that's when the rust mites move in and start feeding. And where they feed, they kills the cells in a small area around their feeding point. So they destroy those rind cells, and it causes little brown spots on mature fruit, and there are little black spots more or less on green fruit. And that's where how you can see that the rust mites are there and feeding. And the majority of the damage will occur in the early spring to early summer, but the rust mites can be there throughout the year and causing damage. Now, the rust mites themselves have no specific predator, in that there are no predators that feed only on the citrus rust mites. However, predatory mites, which are available from mail order companies and sometimes at your garden center to use as control means, will feed on the citrus mites. And so to find out if you have citrus mites, in the early spring you want to check the leaves looking for mites, and the fruit, once it's a ½ inch size or so, looking for mites with your hand lens, or looking for maybe some type of damage. And here we can see what the damage looks like. This is rust mite damage on citrus, both of these. So you can see it's only a cosmetic problem on the fruit, because they're just feeding on the outer skin of the citrus fruit and causing damage, which, as the name implies, looks kind of like rust. It makes the fruit look kind of rusty. So the fruit itself is still very delicious. Sometimes even this predation may cause the fruit to be a little sweeter because of the reaction of the fruit once it's damaged by this rust mite feeding. It's primarily a problem to be controlled in commercial orchards because of the appearance. Just the fact that the fruit doesn't look as appetizing as a clean fruit will sometimes be inducive for commercial growers to use some type of control. The other mite that we might run into is the two-spotted spider mite. Now this one's a little bit larger. A lot of times you can see this guy is running around on the bottom of the leaf. And the reason you can see it so well is, we see here, the scientific name is Tetranychus eurydice, but as you can see, it's a kind of a pale yellow, but it has two dark spots on its body. Thus the common name, two-spotted spider mite. And because it has these two dark spots, a lot of times you can look at the undersurface of a leaf, and you can see these little, look like black dots just moving all around on the bottom of the leaf. And if you got your hand lens and looked a little closer, you'll see it's actually a two-spotted spider mite. It's easier to see because of those two dark spots on its body that makes it show up more against the light green background of the leaf. And if there's a heavy population of the two-spotted spider mites on your trees, they will start to form a web. The reason for the other part of the common name spider mite is that they actually do produce webs. And these webs can be small and hard to see, or they can cover entire leaves and fruit. So the heavier the population, the more webbing you're going to see. And damage from these will cause a yellow stippling appearance on the leaf. If they're feeding on the underside, the upper side will show this yellow stippling pattern, and even can turn to a grayish cast as the feeding increases, and so all these wounds start to coalesce, and it'll put this grayish cast on the foliage. And also, if you look at the underside of the leaf, a lot of times you can see both all mites, you can see the eggs, you can see the cast skins, because as the mites go through the different stages of their life and get larger, they do cast off their outer skin. You can see it laying on along the midrib, a lot of times along the veins, as little white ghost-looking things. You can also see the eggshells all along the veins of the underside of the leaf. So these are more signs that you have a two-spotted spider mite infestation. You can manage the different mites using ultrafine horticultural oils. As mentioned by Anna in the previous one, the horticultural oils are really a really nice control mechanism for a lot of insects, because they don't function in a toxic manner, but they function by covering the insect. They are contact insecticides, so you actually have to get it on the insect, or in this case the mite, and it will smother the insect or the mite because it stops up its breathing apparatus. One precaution with the oils is if you use them in hot weather, they will cause plant damage as well. And another way of controlling mites is using predatory mites. This is a way of biological control for mites. Now, I'm putting these up. I'm not going to go through them very in much detail here. You can look closer at the slide later on, or this will also be in the additional resources, materials that are available. This is put out by the University of Florida Extension Service, and in it, it has the different active ingredients of pesticides that you can use. Along here, it shows you a list of the different insects or mites, essentially arthropods, and whether this particular active ingredient controls them and to what degree it will control them. And also it has whether it has an effect on the natural enemies of those pests. It lists the restricted entry interval and the pre-harvest interval. And this is a two-part publication put out by University of Florida. So if you really are interested in doing some control on these different insects, this is a nice resource and reference to look at. And like you see, if you have leaf miners, you can go through and find, okay, this one has 3 pluses, that means it controls leaf miner. Come over here, you can find the active ingredient and the actual product that that active ingredient is in. And like I said, this is on the additional resources section of the class web page. Now, integrated pest management, that is a form of pest control that the AgCenter and most extension services and most disease and insect control agencies promote now, because integrated pest management is bringing together all the different ways of mitigating damage and caused by diseases and insects in the way that is most effective, has the least environmental impact, and also is the most economical. So we're going to go through a quick talk about IPM, and hopefully we can convince you that that is one good way to approach controlling the insects and the diseases on your citrus plants in your backyard, or all plants essentially in your landscape. So like I said, it's the concept of using a variety of those cultural methods, biological methods, and chemical methods to control insects and mites and diseases as well. And the first step in IPM plan is to, Chris talked about it, we mentioned it in many of our classes. It's very, very important for proper identification of what the problem is with your citrus. Because if you have a problem with nutrition and you're spraying with insecticides, it's not going to help. It's going to do nothing. Or if you have a problem with greasy spot and you think it's citrus canker, what you do is probably not going to be a good plan of action at all. I mean, think of it. Citrus canker is bacterial, greasy spot is fungal. Sometimes they have overlapping control measures, but proper identification is the very first step in a good IPM system. And then the second step is to look at everything that's going on in your backyard orchard or in your landscape and decide what is the best approach for managing this problem, for managing this pest, or preventing the infestation. So you got step one, identify. Step two, what are the different control measures and which one under my current situation is the best. So these are the different control measures that you can go through. One, if you're thinking cultural control, one of the strategies is managing the weeds. Now we covered that a lot in the annual maintenance, and remember we told you weeds can be a source of infestation by both insects and diseases. So keeping the weeds away and control it under your citrus tree and around your citrus tree is one way of eliminating some of the pests. So that's cultural control, and that's a good approach to controlling those. And you also want to be walking around and scouting for insects. Just think about it. The earlier you detect a problem, the easier it is to control. So if you only are going out and checking your tree maybe once every 2 or 3 months, or maybe you go out in the spring and say, wow, there's lots of flowers, I think I'm going to get a lot of fruit this year, and then you go back out there in the fall and say, yep, I got some fruit, I guess it's time to harvest, you're going to have a lot of problems on your citrus, I'll guarantee you, because you're missing a lot of the things that are happening in between flowering and fruit harvest that can really affect your tree. So you want to scout regularly. If you're just out on a stroll through the yard at some point, make it a regular habit to stop. Look at a few leaves on your citrus tree and decide, okay, is there a problem or isn't? And if there is, go back to step one and identify what that is. Then you'll be ready for the next steps. Now we talked about predatory mites, and Anna mentioned in one of the modules about the predatory nematodes that we can use to control the citrus root weevil. So biological control methods, there are a lot of them out there. And so look into additional resources we provide for you that talk about biological control. We have there some places where you can actually order the biological control agents. But this is a really nice way of controlling insects and diseases on your plants, and doesn't use chemicals, so it has very little biological, ecological impact. And the nice thing about most of these predatory insects, you think, okay, we're introducing something new into the environment. What if it takes over and causes problems? Well, most of these biological control organisms, they are feeding specifically on that particular insect or that particular mite. Now, once their population gets high enough that they have eaten or killed all of the mites or all of the insects, there's no food left. So essentially, they're eating themselves out of house and home. So you use the biological control agent, it takes care of your problem, the biological control agent dies. That's good in that it doesn't create a population of something which may or may not cause different problems in the ecosystem, but and the bad part is, well, if the problem comes back, you're going to have to buy more of those control mechanisms. But it's a really good way of controlling problems in your citrus and in your landscape. And usually, the very last control option that we want to turn to is chemical control. If mechanical control or cultural control isn't effective, and then we throw in the biological control mechanisms, and the problem has just gotten so large that that's not going to do it. The final step that we may need to turn to would be chemical control. And the reason we put this as the last step is usually chemical control has the most potential to cause damage to the environment cause damage to beneficial insects or plants or other organisms living in the environment. And so we put this as your last control mechanism. And you can always contact your county agent or your parish agent and get information from them about control mechanisms, the IPM recommendations, because this is an active field of research. There's a lot happening, and there's continual updates on control methods in the IPM system. And so an example of that is as more biological control agents become available, then we add those to the IPM recommendations. So you can always check with your agents to find out about that. And there's also this publication which talks about the pesticides for insect and mite control in the citrus. This is also going to be in your additional resources. This is published annually. You're going to have the 2020 edition in your additional resources. So if you can take a look at that, it tells you if you have a particular pest problem, these are your different options for chemical control. And those are all listed in there. As we said over and over, every time we have a course, using pesticides, always, always, always read the label carefully. Make sure you understand the directions. Make sure you understand any environmental impacts it may have, that you understand everything about what you're about to do before you do it, because the label is the law. And once you purchase a product and it has a label with it, now you are responsible to abide by whatever that label says. So make sure that you read the label, that citrus is listed on the label, that the product can be used on the citrus that you're going to use it on. And when you're reading the label, make sure that you have already identified the problem and that the problem that you're trying to control is listed on that label. If you have two-spotted spider mite and you buy a control product that controls leaf miners and scale and aphids, but it doesn't list that it controls two-spotted spider mite, well, what you've got is not going to help you at all. So make sure when you're reading the label that citrus is on it and that the problem you're trying to control is also listed on there, because the companies have done a lot of research and they only put on the label pests that they know by studies have been controlled using their product. So that's really important to do. And oils, like I said, those are very effective in controlling a lot of insects. Most insects can be controlled with horticultural oils because it smothers them, suffocates the insect. And but you don't want to be using oils in our area after August 1st because it can damage the fruit. And it also can help, it may delay the maturing of the fruit. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't ever want to use horticultural oils or even pesticidal soaps when the temperature is going to be over 85 degrees because they can be phytotoxic. All of this about the pH, that's very important because that's going to be, can affect the efficacy of the product that you're using. If it doesn't work very well in an acid environment or a particularly alkaline environment, then you're mixing a chemical and then inactivating it by the water you use. That is also all on the label. It'll tell you if that's going to be a problem. So now we finished with the citrus arthropods. I talked a little bit about control mechanisms for those. IPM, we really encourage you to check into IPM. Use that as much as possible. And we hope you enjoyed this section of the course. And now we're going to move into diseases. So see you there.